Hey everybody, this is Brad from the Ad Army, and today I have another Pokemon theory for you, one that I've been cooking up for a little while because I really just love this concept. And today, if you haven't seen by the thumbnail, we're going to talk about how the Swords of Justice could have been the ones to seal up the Treasures of Ruin. Now, as always, before I get into it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the Ad Army. It helps, guys. And if you like more content like this, I will keep on bringing it to you. So effectively, let's get to it, because this is actually a theory where it could make sense. However, we don't have all the connecting links yet, but we have little tidbits. So starting off, how is this possible? Now, one thing that's interesting about the Unova region itself, before I say anything else, is that it's really home to two legendary trios. However, due to the forces of nature being effectively all over the place because they're, forces of nature, their roaming status has been limited to just the fact that they could be anywhere. And thanks to Legends Arceus, we know that I think originally they were housed in the Hisui region as, a quartet, I guess, to symbolize that they were a part of maybe a subdivision of the creation trio. So, just putting it out there. But more importantly, this brings us to Unova's other trio that usually gets overlooked, being, our Swords of Justice here, being in Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion here. But the thing that makes them interesting is that they're based off of the Three Musketeers, which is obviously French. The way that they act is more like Robin Hood, which is like an English story, which is kind of strange. But this leads me to believe that maybe just like Terrakion and I'm not Hurricane, but maybe just like the forces of nature, there's a time that the Swords of Justice weren't actually a part of the Unova region, at least up until their arrival. Now, I do actually think they're from Unova personally because they have strong ties to the region, but I do think that maybe they weren't always here, as we see in like the movie that introduced the Swords of Justice. It seems that they roam around the world, solving mysteries. I don't know why I want to say solving mysteries because it's a Scooby-Doo thing, but point aside, they go around and they start doing good things. Now, why would this be important? Well, we have to move to where the theory begins, and I'm just going to get straight into it. So we have to date back to sometime in the distant past of Unova. Now, I would pick specifically the time before the Great War. And I would say the Great War that would take place in Unova being, for light, the truth, and for ideals in the form of, the original dragon, assumingly splitting into both Zekrom and Reshiram. Now, my thing is this. Why would this be the start of their origin? Now, I do think that at this time, it wasn't a war between the two brothers yet and their kingdom, but there was some type of peace where they had Pokemon wielders, and their Pokemon wielders were roaming around, which leads me to believe that the original person and the Swords of Justice were originally partnered with a person. And the reason they were partnered with a trainer would be that in the bios of the Swords of Justice, it talks about how they don't trust humans. The distrust of humans grew. They don't like how humans are affecting the planet. And the first thing that usually comes to mind is a lot of more powerful legendary Pokemon just kind of ignore people altogether. But the Swords of Justice have a personal responsibility and connection to the people. So that means at some point they must have learned how bad humans can be, and probably a negative experience. Which leads me to believe that at one point they were partnered with a person. Now, for the sake of this video, guys, I actually have what I think is a theory, so obviously not my art, but the point is, I actually believe that this would explain why, originally, if you look at the Swords of Justice, even in their standing pose, it feels as if there's no concurrent leader, and we do know that Keldeo is the one that's technically the fourth in their group, their quartet, but also Keldeo is like a leader Pokemon, which usually is the norm when you see the fourth Pokemon for these trios. So this leads me to believe that Cobalion, which is supposed to be the leader of the swords, wasn't originally the Sword of Justice's leader. And he probably assumed the role at some point from whoever the leader was before. So that's why I have this paradox-looking combination of the three animals here. But, that one's in its future paradox form. It's not exact for what I wanted. But, I'm just going to use it as reference. And, yeah, I'll explain who the character is on the side in a second. But yeah, we're going into the theory, which is the man who would become the partner to the Swords of Justice would simply be known as NG. As he would wander the world and leave Unova, he would befriend a specific Pokemon he would find out in the woods. This Pokemon was a strange one, as it looked almost like it was a mishmash of 3 other Pokemon. I don't know what we'll call it, but for the part, I'll just call it the Paradox. As NG and the Paradox befriended one another, it became clear they had a bond, and they would follow suit with it. As although NG wanted to take Paradox with him, Paradox had to take 3 other Pokemon with it. This being a trio of Pokemon that were young upstarters that, under Paradox's tutelage, would become very strong Pokemon in the future. As the young Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion would find their places among Paradox, it was clear that they would all travel together and follow in the footsteps of their leader. As NG accepted this, the 4 Pokemon would traverse the regions, and eventually, they would start to become more notable. As I do believe that NG here is more of our focus as a person who was probably part of the Black and White Kingdom. However, he was probably disjointed for some reason. As usually, I think he probably had a chip on his shoulder to go travel. Or maybe he thought it was ridiculous how both of them were fighting over truth and ideals. So it kind of ties into the fact that I think that NG probably would have left sometime before the war broke out, but both of them were arguing, both the brothers were arguing about the truth and ideal. And I would have him leave with the 4. As they would traverse the mountains and have more adventures, one day it came to the conclusion as they would be traveling through, different regions. And I think the training happens most in Kalos. So wherever they travel to, they'd eventually end up in Kalos and begin some training there, as I think that's the best way to get them in shape, because this would lead into the 3 Musketeer type of lore. And effectively, they show up, and one day they finally call it as they are the Swords of Justice. And I think this is where the name comes from. It'd be fitting, personally, because I think that it'd be both trainer and Pokemon deciding that. And for the idea of it, I also have NG being able to speak with his Pokemon through telepathy. So, that is cool. However, the Swords of Justice would reach their probably pinnacle in time, as this would be so many years down the line. The biggest challenge for them, or the biggest thing that would change them, would be what's happening in Paldea. As in the Paldea region, a new phenomenon was taking place, as its king was realizing that 4 Pokemon were running rampant. These were the Treasures of Ruin. Now, the Treasures of Ruin themselves, I don't think they need too much description, because their bios aren't necessarily important. It's more so how they end up getting sealed by these other Pokemon, by the Swords of Justice. Now, the key things that you guys need to know is that they're actually, they were actually items, and I mean a sword, beads, a table, and I forgot exactly what Wo-Chien is, but, they are actual items that were infected by human malice, evil, their darkness, and eventually it transformed them, and then they had their own sentience. So they ended up taking different things around them to give them bodies. In the form of Wo-Chien, it took dead leaves, making itself a body. And if I remember correctly, for Ting Lu, it started to it took some type of figurine. And then Qian Pao is literally just snow, and we have Chi-Yu, which is, I think, made from beads. So, that's why it looks cool. But point aside, the 4 of them would be causing damage all over the Paldea region, as most of the Paldean Pokemon had no way to stop them, as well as the Paldean trainers, or this time Pokemon wielders. They were unable to utilize their Pokemon effectively because the swords were so... The Treasures of Ruin were so powerful, as each of their abilities were able to shut down most Pokemon. However, this is where NG would appear. Him and the Swords of Justice would undertake the offer by the Paldean King, that in order to stop the Treasures of Ruin, he would be given fame and fortune for his success. However, at this point, he did not care, as the Swords of Justice would go out there to do battle against the Treasures of Ruin. Now, my main spark for the theory of why this would work is that all of the Treasures of Ruin share a typing and a specific move, being Ruination, and they have the dark typing. Now, at first I thought this was just a common anomaly, but with the Swords of Justice, they actually all share something amazing. They have the ability Justified, which, by those who don't know, is when a Pokemon's hit with a dark move, it sharply boosts its attack stat. And in the case of the other swords, they all share a signature move in Sacred Sword. Now, what I believe would be the case is that each of them would be tasked with their own agility mission to take out one of the treasures and stop its rampage. Now, the order of who fights who doesn't really matter. You can put it up to whatever the case is. However, what we end up with is all 4 of the treasures of ruin actually being stopped by the Swords of Justice. And I'd like to believe what would happen is they'd all go for Ruination, which is their signature move, and they would all assume that they've defeated the Sword of Justice, but then they just proc Justified, and the Sword of Justice charges through and takes down the Treasure of Ruin that it faces. Now, we move on to the next leg, as after they are sealed up, which is I think what was done by the Paldean King, because I don't think any of the Swords of Justice have that capability. They would watch as they would see that they were sealed up. However, what they would start to see is, and learn, is more so the effect of greed, as it wouldn't be until sometime after that the Swords of Justice in the Pokemon would notice that something was wrong with NG, as due to his growing influence in Paldea, as well as his renowned enjoying of fame and fortune, he started to change and became more cruel. However, this also was stemming from both the Swords of Justice and NG realizing and learning that the lore of the Treasures of Ruin was that they were actually not even Pokemon to begin with. They said at some point they were just items that the king had wanted through his greed of collecting things, and eventually they came to life and burst out of the castle one day. However, this didn't set well for them, as the people of Paldea just assumed that it was a natural thing, but to NG as well as the Swords of Justice, this upset them because they realized that these things wouldn't even have been a problem had it not been for greed and corruption. As the Swords of Justice began to look around the Paldea region itself, they noticed that a lot of the kingdom was starting to grow and grow, and this was for a reason that was about to come up. But for NG, it kind of shattered his faith among people, as he realized that through their ideals and truth, they would destroy anything and everything just to prove their self. So in order for him to be more, or to keep everything safe, he believed he needed control of everything, and it soon began to plague him. However, all of the amassing of weapons and Pokemon wielders finally made sense, as a war would break out between Paldea and, unfortunately, Kalos as well. Torn between both lines, as before, the Swords of Justice had definitely been housed in the Kalos region as they trained, but they'd be forced to face against those of the Kalos region as they both began to attack sides, and unfortunately NG had to make a choice, as he decided it was best that they would fight alongside Paldea, because at this point there was no other option. The Swords of Justice reluctantly agreed, and they fought in the war as well. However, there would be 2 things that would eventually end this relationship. That being the day that NG would separate from the Swords of Justice, but the Swords of Justice losing their leader. In a very extreme battle that left most Pokemon struggling, the 4 Swords of Justice stood, as many of them were breathing hard, as this had been a long-fought battle. However, another Pokemon arose from the mist, a special Pokemon, a Floette. This one had been so strong it had defeated most of the Pokemon. And unfortunately, as this mountain they were battling on was about to fall apart, it was finally time for Paradox to do what it needed, as Paradox told them, all the Swords of Justice, that it was time to go, as it would stay behind and battle the Floette. However, Cobalion obviously would decline this, as Cobalion wanted to stay next to its master, as it didn't want to just abandon it, but it was not of its choice. And Paradox told it that it was so proud of all of them, but it said it was time for them to depart finally, as they had done so much together, and with NG not being the way that he is anymore, they would need to split up. As Cobalion was told that he was now the leader, he reluctantly understood, as if he continued to battle, Terrakion and Virizion could fall as well. And Paradox made it clear that he was not going to leave the battle until he was satisfied. And Cobalion would make the other 2 swords go, As he reluctantly became the leader of the Swords of Justice that day, it was clear that it was not for their favor. As Paradox and Float would do battle one more time, the explosion from the Sword of Justice clanging against Floet's most powerful attack rang out as the entire mountain shook. However, Cobalion, Virizion, and Terrakion did not look back, because if they did, they would have charged back to help. Upon return to the area where NG was, he asked where Paradox had been, but Cobalion did not say anything, as it was clear from all three of their expressions that Paradox had left. And unfortunately, Paradox was most likely gone. As in battle, most Pokemon fall. As the result would affect NG far more than ever before, he would lose control, as he would scream and be angry that they had lost, but also he was upset at the fact that the three of them didn't stay behind to help. However, this was the moment the telepathy that he shared with them ended, as normally he could hear their voices, but in this case he could not. As by trying to gain control of everything in his life, he finally separated himself by having absolutely no control at all. And from that moment onward, the Swords of Justice understood the severity of the situation, of what the human connections were, but they wouldn't leave until sometime after, as all of a sudden one day, a massive blast was seen in the air. That blast rang up through the air and then crashed to where Area 0 would be today, as the massive attack devastated both Paldea and Kalos itself through its population of Pokemon's decrease due to the ultimate weapon being fired. The Swords of Justice finally saw in truth that humans were very problematic, and in order, at least for now, they would not trust any. As after NG searched far and wide in Paldea, he could not find them, and resided to his other options of just going back home, believing that maybe one day he would see the swords again, but not as the man that he was, as the man that he is now, unfortunately plagued by his lack of control and want for control. And guys, that's how the Swords of Justice sealed up the Treasures of Ruin. Now, most of this theory, obviously, is focused more on an additional origin for the Swords of Justice, but hey, that's just how I view it, because, to be honest, I like the Treasures of Ruin, but I don't think that they're actually that dangerous in the hindsight. They're more powerful in, like, competitive Pokemon, but when it comes to the fact of how the lore talks about how the Paldean King called in Pokemon wielders to deal with them, and eventually they captured them, I don't like to think about it like, oh, maybe they just pounced on them one day and kind of just tied them up and then chained them into their chambers. I prefer something more deep and thorough, where like maybe some heroes came in, knocked them down. But then it also focuses on the story that would lead to the origin of like Generation 5, which NG obviously is a combined for N's name, but as well as G for Getsis. So, you know, just putting it out there, guys. Point is, he would be their ancestor, and eventually the problems he shared would eventually pass on to Getsis, and eventually, you know, N would be the one that's basically like the reincarnate that talks to all Pokemon. So, you know, basically that's how I have that there, guys. But if you like that, please leave a like and comment as always. This has been this theory, and I really hope you guys like it. So, have a good day, guys. Watch the rest of Giving Week, and, you know, take care.